Week 9 of the 2024 fantasy football season is in the books, so we're headed straight into Week 10 of the 2024 fantasy football season, and you guys know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, every single running back, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting as we approach Week 10. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 10 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code DCatch a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 10's action. And on top of that, all new users who sign up with promo code DCatch are also going to get a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em for Week 10 and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code DCatch. That link is down below. Very quickly, we have 4 bye weeks here in Week 10. We'll be without the Packers, so no Josh Jacobs. We'll be without the Raiders, so no Alexander Madison. No Cleveland Browns, no Nick Chubb, and no Seattle Seahawks, so no Kenneth Walker. Make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. Let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We have the Bengals traveling to face the Ravens, and Chase Brown has just taken over this backfield for the Cincinnati Bengals. 26.7 fantasy points in Week 9, 120 yards on the ground, 5 targets, 5 catches, 37 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Now, it's worth noting he did suffer a bruised rib in that victory over the Raiders in that big day. Did have to exit at one point, but was able to come back. Should be okay here. Should be good to go in Week 10. So if you own Chase Brown, you are still starting Chase Brown this week. On the other hand, Zach Moss is out indefinitely with a neck injury. So who else do we have here? Travion Williams is on the field for 9% of snaps this past week. Chris Evans is on IR. Kendall Milton, 7% of snaps. Bengals may go out and sign a veteran running back or trade for Khalil Herbert, or I don't know. But right now, if you own Chase Brown, you are feeling very good. If anyone else pops up for this week, we're not starting them. I know it's a bad matchup, but it is a short week, which can sometimes help here. I still think Chase Brown, due to volume, is a solid start this week, even if the ceiling against the Ravens' run defense is a little bit lower. Now, on the other hand, we start Derrick Henry no matter what, just period. Doesn't matter who he's facing. He is a touchdown in every game this season. He is a rushing touchdown in every game but Week 7, where he did have a receiving touchdown against the Bucs. So, Henry, your RB1 in fantasy football. I think that's probably going to stick for the whole season. He's on pace for 2,000 rushing yards. Yeah, start Derrick Henry. Justice Hill, a sit for me. Way too hard to call when he's going to pop off and when he's not going to. Keep an eye on Keaton Mitchell. He could return here in Week 10 for the Ravens. It'll be interesting to see how much involvement he gets, but probably not a whole lot there for Justice Hill or Keaton Mitchell when Derrick Henry is involved. So for the most part, we're looking at our studs here. Chase Brown, Derrick Henry, strong starts on Thursday Night Football. Next, we have the Giants, who will travel to face the Panthers. Tyrone Tracy was good enough, but probably didn't get you over the hump this past week. Unfortunately, I was expecting a much bigger game out of Tyrone Tracy. Still looked good, 4.13 yards per carry, but just 66 yards on the ground and 1 reception for 3 receiving yards, 7.9 fantasy points. But he is still the clear-cut RB1 for the Giants, and we cannot ignore this matchup against the Panthers, as this run defense for the Panthers continues to be one of the worst in the NFL. Devin Singletary, 7 touches this past week. It was more than the previous 2 weeks, but not enough there for me. Eric Gray doesn't really even need to be in the discussion. He's basically completely irrelevant outside of the return game at this point in the season. But he's going to be a sit as well. So this is Tyrone Tracy's backfield. I know this is an early game, overseas game, but we're not going to ignore this matchup. He's a solid start this week. That Chuba Hubbard continues to be a solid start. Encourage you guys to start him going up against that awful Saints run defense this past week after the down game against the Broncos in week 8. 72 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns, 21.2 fantasy points. Chuba continues to be a strong start. I think that a lot of people are going to freak out this week because we're expecting Jonathan Brooks to make his NFL debut here in week 10. I think he'll be kind of limited on a snap count. Chuba has been a clear-cut RB1 all season long. They're not just going to swap out Chuba Hubbard for Jonathan Brooks here. He'll be on a snap count. This is probably not the week to go out and start Jonathan Brooks, and I'm probably not going to encourage you guys to start him until we get some sort of consistent pattern emerge. So the Panthers are on bye week in week 11. I'm not expecting a big game out of Brooks this week. And I probably will put Miles Sanders a little bit lower on this depth chart. He had just 1 fantasy point in week 9. We're not considering him anyways. Moving along to Sunday afternoon, we're going to have the Patriots traveling to face the Bears. Ramondre Stevenson, 22.4 fantasy points against the Titans. Just 16 rushing yards, but a touchdown, 5 receptions for 38 receiving yards, and an additional receiving touchdown. There's this Bears defense, I mean, they're nothing to sneeze at, but they're also a little bit wishy-washy. I would say Ramondre Stevenson is a solid start this week, especially with all the bye weeks and everything. Go ahead and start Ramondre Stevenson, and let's sit Antonio Gibson, who's just not relevant from a fantasy perspective. Now, DeAndre Swift, I was expecting maybe a little bit more out of this past week. His first game since week 3 of the season with no touchdown, but he still got you 14.2 fantasy points, 51 yards on the ground, 6 targets, 6 grabs, 31 receiving yards. So DeAndre Swift is still a solid start against a Patriots defense that is very bad against the run. So I won't be surprised if we see Swift stumble into the end zone here in week 10. Roschon Johnson, just 4.1 fantasy points this past week. He is nothing but a handcuff. So we're starting our 2 starting running backs, and we're sitting everybody else in this matchup between the Patriots and the Bears. All right, next up, we have the Niners traveling to face the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and we are expecting Christian McCaffrey's return. Finally. So what do we do here? I'm going to start Christian McCaffrey. I'm just not scared of this Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense right now. If you own Christian McCaffrey, this is what we've been waiting for. Now, there's a very realistic possibility that we see touches to Jordan Mason, that we even see touches to Isaac Guerrero this week. But I'm going to take Christian McCaffrey in my starting lineup. If you don't want to do it, that's fine. But if you've been holding Christian McCaffrey this long, if you traded for Christian McCaffrey, this is what we're waiting for. So I think for the most part, he probably will have a good floor this week in his first start. I don't know how high the ceiling will be, but I think that he's startable. Now, I will say, I think that we could still see touches to Jordan Mason. He could have some value in this game, which looks like it could make for a good game script. But yeah, I don't really think that I want to start Jordan Mason or Isaac Guerrero. Ultimately, I'm okay with just avoiding the situation as a whole to see how the volume looks and how the snap count looks for everybody here. Don't forget, Jordan Mason was banged up in week 8. The Niners on bye week this past week, and Guerrero looked good in week 8 against the Cowboys, who are awful against the run. But so I could get wanting to just stay away and see what happens here. But I think if you own Christian McCaffrey, like, come on, you want to throw him out there, right? If I own him, I'm going to start him. All right, Bucky Irving, Rachaad White, Sean Tucker, the 3-headed backfield for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. As a reminder, I have to record these before Monday Night Football has been played, so if any major injuries happen, if my thoughts ultimately change on this backfield, there will be a pinned comment down below. But I think that Bucky Irving and Rachaad White are very startable in this matchup. This offense needs both of these guys right now with no Mike Evans, no Chris Godwin. Sterling Shepard's banged up. Jalen McMillan is banged up. I mean, this offense is relying on these 2 running backs and Cade Otton. So I think that there will be enough volume through the air and on the ground for Bucky Irving and Rachaad White. Sean Tucker, the odd man out here. Week 6 was probably an anomaly. So you don't really need to roster him unless we see an injury to Irving or White. So see what happens in Monday Night Football, but ultimately I'm okay starting both of these Buccaneers running backs going into Week 10. Next up, we have the Broncos, who will travel to face the Kansas City Chiefs. And I know Javonte squeezed out a double-digit performance this past week. That's fine, 10.4 fantasy points. He gets the volume. That's fine. If you're really desperate, sure, you could throw out Javonte, but we're getting reports that Audric Estime is going to start to get more touches. And ultimately, I just don't like this matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs defense, giving up the fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. The Broncos offense certainly wasn't overly inspiring on the road against the Ravens in week 9. So I'm going to sit Javonte. Once again, Monday Night Football has not been played at the time I'm recording this, but I think Kareem Hunt's going to continue to be a good start. It's a tough matchup. The Broncos have been pretty good against the run for most of the season, but they did just get completely gassed by Derrick Henry. Don't know if that's fair to really consider here because it's Derrick Henry, but Kareem Hunt, I think, is just a solid start until we see Isaiah Pacheco return. And anybody else involved here, I mean, maybe, you see one of these other guys pop off here and there, whether it's Pirine or Steele, or we maybe see Clyde Edwards-Helaire finally make his return this year. But ultimately, Kareem Hunt is the only running back that I would consider overall in this Week 10 matchup between the Broncos and the Chiefs. Next up, we have the Buffalo Bills, who are going to travel to face the Indianapolis Colts. So a little bit of a down week for James Cook in Week 9 and a great matchup. Good game script. He usually gets pretty involved in the pass game, and he was 6 targets, 5 catches, 25 receiving yards, but just 44 yards on the ground. No touchdown after having 4 touchdowns in his last 3 starts. But you own James Cook. He's a top 10 running back in fantasy football. You are starting James Cook. Ray Davis had a big day, but that was really because he had that big catch that led to a 63-yard touchdown. Outside of that, just 20 yards on the ground and one additional 7-yard catch. But he did have 17 fantasy points, and a lot of people are going to look at the last couple of weeks and say, well, Ray Davis has 3 fantasy performances that led to double digits in his last 4 starts, but once again, a garbage time touchdown in Week 7, the big play in Week 9, nothing in Week 8, and then in Week 6, James Cook did not play. So, yeah, Ray Davis is a fantastic handcuff and a very good handcuff. He does have some standalone value, but good luck kind of guessing when that standalone value is going to actually show up. So I do like Ray Davis, but I'm not going to start him. Ty Johnson is 2.3 fantasy points. We're not starting him. Now, Jonathan Taylor, 8.9 fantasy points, a down performance against the Vikings, and really just a down performance for the entire Colts offense this past week. So 48 rushing yards, 5 targets, 3 catches. I still think when you own Jonathan Taylor, you just start Jonathan Taylor. Ultimately on the season, this Buffalo Bills defense has not been good against the run, so try not to read too much into this. Bad overall offensive performance. The Vikings have been very good against the run on the season. JT is still a start this week. Anybody else involved, whether it's Tyler Goodson or Trey Sermon, we're not looking to start either of these guys as we move into Week 10. Next up, we have the Steelers, who will travel to face the Washington Commanders. The Steelers on bye week in Week 9, but before that bye week, Najee Harris, 16.1 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, double digits in every game except for Week 5 against Dallas since Week 3. This is Najee Harris's backfield. The Commanders' defense, well, nothing to sneeze at, but we're going to continue to start Najee Harris until further notice, and I would do so with confidence. Jaylen Warren, I mean, he's a guy who can get you 5, 7, 8 points if you're desperate. But for the most part, I'm just staying away from Jaylen Warren. Not enough volume, not enough opportunity. And this is Najee Harris's backfield at the end of the day. Now, we look at the Commanders. Brian Robinson Jr. missed this past week. But I think you always start Brian Robinson Jr. if you own him. I know he had the down game in Week 8, missed this past week. So if you own him, you might be feeling kind of shaky about things. But this is still a great offense that wants to run the football first and foremost for the most part. So he is a solid start as long as he's healthy. Austin Eckler got the start this past week. We talked about him in the Sneaky Starts video a little bit earlier in the week before Brian Robinson Jr. was announced as out. He had 42 rushing yards, 8 touchdowns, and 3 catches for 41 receiving yards, 17.3 fantasy points. Austin Eckler's kind of always in that, you can start him if you don't have better options, fringe RB2 area, desperation flex area. You never know, like, if he's going to get involved in the passing game, if he's going to steal a touchdown. I mean, you look on the season, So far on the year, he only has two single digit performances in games that he has played. So I do like Austin Eckler as a fringe running back on a weekly basis, but you just got to understand that there is still risk involved when it comes to Eckler. Then we got Jeremy McNichols. Had some more opportunity this past week with no Brian Robinson Jr., walked away with just 2 fantasy points. So he continues to be a sit as we get into week 10. Next up, we have the Vikings, who are going to travel to face the Jaguars, and this is a smash spot for Aaron Jones, who's been fantastic so far on the season. So just 2 games with single digits for Aaron Jones, 12.2 fantasy points in week 9, 64 rushing yards, 4 grabs. Aaron Jones on a weekly basis, the ceiling's not always crazy high, but the production is there and the double-digit fantasy performances are there as well. So continue to roll with Aaron Jones, no matter what, especially against the Jacksonville Jaguars. This should be a week where he has high upside. Ty Chandler, just a handcuff. Hardly any standalone value. 0 fantasy points this past week. Stay away. All right, the Jags running backs I'm also staying away from, okay? We saw finally a healthy backfield. We saw 8 touches to Tank Bigsby for 22 rushing yards. 3 touches for ETN, 24 rushing yards. 2 grabs, 6 receiving yards. Dearness Johnson did have a touchdown callback, but 2 touches, 6 rushing yards. So, we saw less than 8 fantasy points out of these 3 running backs, and now they're going up against the Minnesota Vikings, who have a great run defense, who just held Jonathan Taylor to his worst fantasy performance of the season. I'm staying far away from the Jacksonville Jaguars backfield. I want nothing to do with it. I don't want to start any of these guys. They're all sits for me here in week 10. Next up, we have the Falcons traveling to face the Saints, and this is another matchup where we're looking at 2 studs and 2 handcuffs. So Bijan Robinson, you start him every single week, no matter what. Early in the season, we had no panic on Bijan Robinson. Encourage you guys to go out and trade for him if there was a buy low window. And now he has had 21.5 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games. 4 touchdowns in his last 4 games. No touchdowns in week 9, but still over 20 fantasy points, 86 yards on the ground, 7 targets, 7 catches, 59 receiving yards. He now has 7 targets and 7 catches in 2 straight games. Love to see him getting involved in the passing game as well. And this Saints defense has been bad overall, but especially bad against the run. So start Bijan Robinson. I know Algier found the end zone this past week. He's a fantastic handcuff, one of the best handcuffs in all of football, but we're not going to start Tyler Algier. Maybe if you're really, really, really desperate due to matchup, sure, he might get you some points, but let's keep it at that. All right, Alvin Kamara, on the other hand, my oh my, 27.5 fantasy points in week 9 against that awful Panthers run defense. 155 yards on the ground, 9 targets, 6 grabs, 60 receiving yards. I mean, he is so heavily involved in the passing game, especially with all of these wide receivers for the Saints basically down for the count now. We're looking at guys like Alvin Kamara and Taysom Hill to pick up that load. Foster Moreau at the tight end position, right? So Alvin Kamara, a must-start running back no matter what. 1 single-digit fantasy performance on the season so far. Week 7 on a short week with Spencer Rattler against the Denver Broncos. Outside of that, 12.6 or more fantasy points in every game for Alvin Kamara. You start him no matter what. Jamal Williams, nothing but a handcuff here, and he missed this past week. That's my mistake. He's still a sit, though. Kendre Miller also missed this past week. So we saw Jordan Mims get 5 touches, and then we have Adam Prentice on this team as well. That's their fullback. My mistake. So the point being is that we are only starting Alvin Kamara when it comes to the Saints running back room. So we got 2 studs in this matchup. Fire them up. Everybody else in this matchup is a sit here in week 10. Next up, we have the Titans, who are going to travel to face the Chargers. Tony Pollard, one of my must-start players this past week going into week 9, 18.4 fantasy points, 128 yards on the ground, 3 receptions for 26 receiving yards. Now, that was against the New England Patriots, who have become one of the worst run defenses in the NFL. This week, he will be going up against the Chargers, one of the best run defenses in the NFL, but I still think the way this offense is ran, you got to continue to start Tony Pollard if you own him. I know we got a little bit of excitement at the end of the week, being that Julius Chestnut may have been a streaming option, but then Tony Pollard played, and that got thrown out the window, so Chestnut finished with just 2.2 fantasy points. Josh Kelly was activated to this roster. He got no touches. Tajay Spears is still dealing with that hamstring injury. So Tony Pollard is the only startable player here, but maybe tamper your expectations of a high ceiling game due to the matchup. J.K. Dobbins, on the other hand, in a great spot after having 24.5 fantasy points against a pretty good Browns run defense. 14 touches, 85 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns, 2 catches, 20 receiving yards. Now he gets this Titans run defense that is increasingly getting worse week by week. Dobbins, a smash play this week, a must-start player. If you own J.K. Dobbins, make sure he is not on your bench this week. As far as any other running back on this team, they are all sits. So we got 2 studs in this matchup. Let's roll with them. I know for a lot of these matchups, it looks like we're just saying start the starting running back, sit everybody else. But really, through the course of the whole season, that's what we have been looking at the running back position. And that is a good thing. We haven't seen nearly as many injuries to the running back position as we have to the wide receiver position. And running back play on the season so far has been very, very strong. So let's cross our fingers and hope that it stays that way. Except we have the Jets, who are going to travel to face the Cardinals. And Breece Hall, it's been a little bit of a lower ceiling the past 2 weeks. Did have 10.5 fantasy points on Thursday Night Football, 11 receiving yards off of 2 receptions, 74 yards on the ground. Was still efficient on the ground. Only had 9.9 fantasy points against the Texans in Week 8, against the Patriots in Week 8. But was also, once again, efficient on the ground, 5 yards per carry, 80 total rushing yards. So, I know things have looked a little bit bleak as Breece Hall owners. That ceiling has kind of disappeared that we were finally getting back in Week 6 and 7, but yeah, I'm going to continue to roll with Breece Hall on a weekly basis. DeAndre Swift didn't find the end zone this past week against the Cardinals, but still looked pretty sharp overall. Breece Hall still a solid start. Braylon Allen, I'm telling you guys, don't let these random touchdown games get you all excited. He's nothing but a handcuff. 0.9 fantasy points in Week 9. He's a good handcuff, but nothing more than a handcuff as we get into Week 10. Then we saw a very interesting day out of the Cardinals' backfield. We saw a touchdown to each of the 3 running backs on this team, not including DJ Dallas, who coincidentally did have 1 rushing attempt in this game, but outside of that has only been used in the return game. But James Conner, 14.9 fantasy points, 107 rushing yards. That's my mistake. He did not score a touchdown. He just had a big day on the ground in general. 3 targets, 3 receptions, 12 receiving yards. Then we saw Amari DeMarcado score a touchdown, 59 rushing yards, and basically sealed the game for the Cardinals. 2 receptions, 21 receiving yards. Trey Benson, a touchdown, 37 rushing yards, and an 18-yard reception. So maybe continue to keep an eye on guys like DeMarcado and Trey Benson, especially if something happens to James Conner, God forbid. But this is still James Conner's backfield. He's the only running back getting consistent double-digit touches for the Cardinals. It's a great matchup at home against the Jets. And this Cardinals team, a little bit sneaky right now as they approach their Week 11 bye week. So James Conner a start. Everyone else a sit. But let's keep a close eye on the rest of these Cardinals running backs as we get into Week 10. Next up, we have the Eagles traveling to face the Cowboys. Saquon Barkley, human joystick, Madden in real life. Fantastic, fantastic day against an awful Jags run defense in Week 9. 159 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 3 receptions, 40 receiving yards, and another touchdown. Saquon Barkley, you start him no matter what. He is dealing with a little bit of a back injury potentially, but I think he'll be good to go. This is a big divisional game for the Cowboys, or excuse me, for the Eagles, and I guess also for the Cowboys. But really, a lot of the divisional games for the Eagles are here in the back half of the season. They've played the Giants once. Outside of that, they have not played any divisional games. So this is a big matchup. Then they get the Commanders the following week. So Saquon Barkley is going to be needed in this matchup. It's a great matchup as the Cowboys have struggled overall, but have also struggled against the run in general. So start Saquon Barkley than anybody else involved here. Kenneth Gainwell, 5 touches this past week. Will Shipley was on the field for 1% of snaps. So they're just handcuffs if something were to happen to Barkley, God forbid. Outside of that, we are not starting them. At the Cowboys running backs, I told you guys going into week 9 that I was okay starting Rico Dowdle. He missed week 8 due to the illness, but had 3 double-digit fantasy performances in his last 3 starts. But I'm a little bit worried about him this week because this Eagles defense looks very good against the run. And now we know that Dak Prescott's not going to be playing this week. I don't think Cooper Rush is an awful backup by any stretch, but we look at Rico Dowdle's touchdowns. They've come off of receptions, essentially all of them in the red zone. And Prescott and Dowdle just kind of have this good chemistry in the red zone. So I'm a little bit worried about the upside for Rico Dowdle. We know CeeDee Lamb might miss this week. He might not. Worried about this offense in general. The Eagles defense has looked good. I think if you're desperate, this is still the Cowboys running back that you want to start. But I'm going to try and avoid him this week. In terms of anybody else, Ezekiel Elliott, Deuce Vaughn, Dalvin Cook, just no thank you. Stay away from any other running back on this team as we go into week 10. All right, Sunday Night Football, we have a fantastic matchup between the Lions and the Texans. So this is a tough matchup on paper for the Lions running backs, but I can't imagine a single week. I mean, there has not been a single week this season where I've told you guys to sit David Montgomery or Jahmyr Gibbs. They are starts for me every single week. A little bit of a lower ceiling at 12.6 fantasy points in week 9 for Monty. A little bit of a lower ceiling at 14.6 points in week 9 for Gibbs. But these guys come through almost every single week with double-digit fantasy performances. Between the two, they only have one single-digit performance, and that was Monty in week 7 against the Vikings. And if he hadn't fumbled in that game, he would have scraped out a double-digit performance. So I start both of them every single week. Maybe a lower ceiling, but they both always have the potential to pop off as well. So if you own a Lions running back, have confidence. This is going to be a good game script this week. You start both of them. Joe Mixon finally came to earth in week 9 with 16.6 fantasy points after having 23.4 or more fantasy points in every game he had fully started in on the season. So if a lower ceiling for Mixon is 16.6 fantasy points, 106 yards on the ground, and a touchdown, then I think we're going to be okay. Now, this Lions run defense, certainly nothing to sneeze at, but Joe Mixon is a solid start no matter what. There is no way you are benching him. Darway Agunbawale, Damian Pierce, anybody else involved here are simply just sits. So, stud running backs in this matchup on Sunday Night Football. We are starting them all here in week 10. All right, last but not least, we're going to have the Dolphins traveling to face the LA Rams. And Devon Achane has been on fire the past 2 weeks. 26.7 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts. 32.1 in week 9 against Buffalo, his best mark on the season. 63 yards on the ground, a rushing touchdown, 58 yards through the air off of 8 targets, 8 receptions, and a receiving touchdown. He now has 6 or more receptions in his last 2 games. He is heavily involved in this offense, and since the return of Tua Tagovailoa, Devon Achane has been the player who has benefited the most. So fire him up in a good matchup against the Rams on Monday Night Football. The other line on Underdog that I absolutely love this week is Devon Achane's total rushing yards, sitting at 59.5. He has hit that in 3 straight games. This is a great matchup against the Rams. Should be a nice competitive game script, so I would be heading straight to Underdog. Take the over on Achane's rushing yards. Then don't forget, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, are getting that free NFL Pick Em for the week on Underdog. Take your free Pick Em. Take the over on Achane's rushing yards. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. Raheem Mostert has seen some volume, still had 10 touches and 2 targets, 2 catches this past week. He had 2 touchdowns in week 8, 11 touches in week 7, 19 in week 5, the bye week in week 6 for the Dolphins. So sure, maybe you see him scrape out a touchdown or something, but you can really only start him if you're just beyond desperate, in my opinion. Jalen Wright, not enough volume here whatsoever, so we're going to sit him. And yeah, we're probably sitting Raheem Mostert for the most part as well. Maybe the bye weeks and injuries got you. You could maybe throw Mostert out there for some points. Kyron Williams had his worst fantasy day so far on the season in week 9 against Seattle. The game script definitely did not benefit him. 10.5 fantasy points, 69 yards on the ground, and 1 reception for 26 receiving yards. So we saw Kyron Williams' first game where he did not score a touchdown so far in the season. But still got you double digits. It's a great matchup against the Dolphins, who have struggled against the run. This Rams offense overall looks much, much better with Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp. Matthew Stafford looks happy. Kyron Williams is a very strong start this week. Blake Corum, Ronnie Rivers, anyone else involved here are just handcuffs, not players that we want to start whatsoever at this point in the season. So once again, we got 2 studs. We're starting them, and we're going to sit everybody else here in week 10. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single matchup, every single player at the running back position for week 10 of 2024 fantasy football, and who you guys should be starting, who you guys should be sitting. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comments section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into the week, drop me a comment. I'll get every single comment answered before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. And more importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel, because we're going to have everything you could possibly need here on the channel to help you guys dominate week 10 of 2024 fantasy football. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.